Now, Marty, what's that up there?
Behind me is the Rockies Cemetery, consecrated in 1847 to cater for the many people who died of fever in the Westport Workhouse on the opposite side of the railway bridge here. And initially it was an old quarry, and the first graves dug in it were mass graves where unknown numbers of people who died in the Westport Workhouse were buried. Later on we'll be moving down to the old railway line, and we'll have a talk about the workhouse and the cemetery.
And was there something about babies being put in there at one time?
Yes. At the time when the Catholic Church forbade the burial in cemeteries of anyone who wasn't baptized or anyone who might have committed suicide, the Rocky Cemetery here was used for the burial of unbaptized infants by people of Westport Town and of the area.
Is there any record of who was put in here or how many were put in here?
Unfortunately no, and it's a big research project. But hopefully it will be undertaken. Even in my youth and when I was a young man, I was aware of burials of unbaptized infants in the Rocky Cemetery here behind me.
It's very run down now and very raggedy. Is there
hopefully, as of now, there's a plan to do something to have it more officially recognised as sacred ground, and hopefully through a project of the Westport community we'll have a plaque erected along the old railway walk indicating its presence first of all, and then hopefully we'll get access points into a Celtic cross which was erected in the Rocky Cemetery years ago by Father Tony King and John Coffey. And we're holding it here in the vicinity of the Rocky Cemetery today, primarily to pray for all buried in the Rocky Cemetery, which is the far side of the bridge, and we'll move over there later and indicate exactly where it is. We're remembering all who are buried in the Rocky Cemetery, and they include many people who died in Westport Workhouse, which was located just at the top of this embankment here. I have a photograph here which shows a section of the workhouse, which was actually a huge establishment, and the large building at the left in this photograph was the infirmary or the hospital, which was at the top of the embankment here, and then all the workhouse buildings extended out towards the Quay Road and went along by the Leanon Road. In fact, there are sections of the old workhouse wall still existing along the Leanon Road. There was a very high workhouse wall along here, which was redeveloped and made into this low wall. Anyway, that's Shinshkelele. But the wall on the left, running up along at the edge of the little wood, that's a remnant of the original workhouse wall, running up along, and it goes along by the side of the Carnamarth housing estate. The cemetery of the Rocky was created to serve Westport Workhouse, as I said, which was at the top of the hill here. After the workhouse closed down, the workhouse property was demolished, and it's on that site that the Carnamarth Council Housing Estate was built. At the time, and I think it still is, the largest council housing estate in Westport. Many of the original houses still there. Most of them have been naturally remodeled at this stage. Now, I was hoping John Mayock, chairman of the Westport Historical Society, would join us, and he had planned to join us, and hopefully he'll still come along, because John has done extensive research into Westport Workhouse and actually examined the actual minute books of the Westport Board of Guardians who operated the workhouse. And on one occasion I spent many nights at his home going through the actual minute book which John had been given a loan of from the National Archives, and going through all the copperplate recordings of details of everything about Westport Workhouse. And I can tell you it's raised a lot of goose pimples on me, because just to link in the present with the past, my mother was born in the hospital of Westport Workhouse, at the top of the hill there. But as I said, the reason we're here is to remember the dead buried in the Rockies Cemetery, and to reinforce the fact that it is consecrated ground. A lot of people were making little of protests that concerned people had in the community here, when a digger went in and started clearing a path to the top of the little hillock there, and bones were being exposed, and there was a view in some quarters that it wasn't a consecrated cemetery at all. But I'll quote you from historic documents. On August 23rd, 1847, the Catholic chaplain of Westport Workhouse consecrated a quarry near the workhouse for use as a mass grave. So initially, so many people were dying in the workhouse that they had to consider burials in mass graves. Now, John Mayock, from his research, has discovered that contrary to a lot of people's beliefs, the majority of the deaths were not caused by starvation or hunger during the famine. They were caused by fever. In fact, they reckon the number who died of fever and the epidemic of 47 and the year before and after it was 10 times the number who died from starvation, malnutrition and hunger. The fever was the big killer. Just by of historical context, there were 7 workhouses in County Mayo. Ballina, Ballinrobe, Belmullet, Castlebar, Claremorris, Swinford and Westport. The hospitals at Ballina, Belmullet, Castlebar and Swinford were retained following the closure of the workhouses.
The ought to buy it mass,
I'll be handing over the mic shortly now. We have a number of people here who have very interesting contributions to make to today's talk, which will conclude with Father Micheál saying prayers. But apart from specified people, Joanne, Nolene, Dimpna, Risha, if anyone here wants to make any comment relative to the workhouse and the cemetery, please feel free to do so, or to ask questions. I mightn't be able to answer them, but I'll get someone to answer. The minutes of the Board of Guardians meeting of August the 18th, 1847, records an angry dispute over the erection of a fever shed. I mentioned how most deaths were caused by fever. And as now, sometimes people like to blot out the actual reality of the situation and the truth. There were many members of the Board of Guardians who didn't want it known or declared that there was a fever epidemic in the workhouse. And when it was proposed to erect a fever shed in the grounds of the workhouse, there was holy war among the board members. And on the day of that meeting, August the 18th, 1847, there were 106 inmates seriously ill from fever at the hospital, at the workhouse. Now just to jump from the time of the operation of the workhouse, in October 1920, there was a conference, the first conference was held proposing the amalgamation of workhouses. And at that time, the 7 workhouses in Mayo had 470 inmates, but had accommodation for over 5,000. In fact, a year later, in 1921, the 7 Mayo workhouses had 545 persons accommodated at them. And the total accommodation being provided was for 5,640. And everything in life boils down to economics. There was a lot of economic factors, as Nolene Beckett and her late dad Matt. The transfer of the hospital unit from Westport, or the closing down of it and its transfer to Castlebar, was largely economic. Matt and his predecessors as members of the councils here would have fought to have it retained. But anyway, the cost of operating the workhouse the workhouses in the county in 1921 was 37,000, and that was at the cost of the ratepayers of the county. And there were 173 officials being paid salaries totaling 8,857. The ratio of officials to actual patients in all of the workhouse in Mayo in 1921 was 1 official per 3 patients. So, as Henry says, some things don't change at all. I'm taking these in random order. They may not be linked. Now, after the hospital closing, or after the workhouse was officially closed here in 1921, and I just record, there were a number of people on the Board of Guardians and members of the council at the time who vehemently opposed it, but in vain. Notably, there was a Michael Staunton, there was a Thaddeus Walsh, and Eamon Moan. And actually, Michael Staunton and Thaddeus Walsh, Michael Staunton and Eamon Moan declined to serve on the new board looking after the new county home in Castlebar and the county hospital. They declined to serve because they felt very aggrieved that Castlebar Workhouse had simply been declared the place where the central workhouse of the county would be, without inspectors having come to see the facilities of the Westport Workhouse, which was deemed by many to be the ideal place to have the central workhouse for the county. Also, I mentioned there about the economics. When the decision was made to close down all of the workhouses except Castlebar, there were economic factors involved. Patient cost at Westport Workhouse was 11 shillings and 10 pence per week, whereas the corresponding cost per patient at the central workhouse in Castlebar was just 6 shillings and 6 pence, about half the cost. Thanks, Laimy. Following the representation of the men I mentioned there, Staunton, Welsh, and Moore, and Ed Moore from Carabod, there was a kind of a stay put on the closure of the hospital until an inspector, Dr. Barrett, came down from Dublin, examined the situation and gave his report and assessment. But he reckoned there was on the day he made the inspection, there wasn't a single acute medical case in the hospital, and for the reasons I pointed out, the cost didn't warrant its retention. Bane O'Brien are there. So on September 17, 1921, a meeting of Mayo County Council formally decided to close workhouses and make Castlebar Workhouse the new county or central home to which inmates from all the others were to be transferred. Now my own brother John Curry, domiciled in Dublin, did a study of all of this process of closing down of the workhouses, and I have a copy of an article he did for the Carnamart Journal some years ago, and there's a section in it where my brother John describes all the administration and details of procedures. And if I get a chance, I'll read really horrific regulations attached to the transfer of the inmates from all the workhouses. Well, maybe I'll read it now. Some people might be disturbed by this, but you know, when you hear of what went on in the Tuam unmarried mother's home and Magdalene laundries and all of that, like it's, yeah, would you read it, please? I have to confess, because of my links through my mother's birth in the hospital at the workhouse here, I get upset when I read this. I just get Laimy to read just a couple of the paragraphs here, and you'll realise what I'm talking about.
One section is just called Children. As many as possible of the children in the workhouse were to be boarded out, fostered. No child over the age of 3 years was to be retained in the central home. Should it be found impracticable to board out certain children, the committee, at their discretion, should have them transferred to an industrial school or similar institution. Unmarried, expectant mothers and unmarried mothers. A separate section in the central home was to be set aside for unmarried mothers, who were regarded as, quote, the most difficult problem for solution in any proposed scheme of reform. The scheme noted that the presence of this particular class would be a stigma on the status of the central home. The Home and Hospitals Committee was therefore to consider transferring these undesirables to sewing, knitting, etc. Idiots and imbeciles. To arrange, with the consent of the Committee of Management of the County Asylum, the transfer of idiots and imbeciles to the asylum buildings. According to the scheme, no institution can be called a home where this class is retained. That's it then.
That's just a sample of you know, the really horrific regime that existed at the time. And just to give me a break and ye a break from me, I mentioned about the cemetery being created here at what is locally known as the Rocky. Apparently it was a quarry area, and it was used for mass burials. Now, I'd hoped, as I said, that John Mayock would be here, but I don't know if anyone has actually done a research project to establish the names of those who went into the mass graves here. It would be a really, really difficult research project, but I have no information about it. Father Mehold mentioned before we started there that many of our ancestors could be buried there. But in addition to those who died at the workhouse and at the workhouse hospital and who were buried there, in my youth, I was aware that mothers who gave birth to stillborn babies, or babies who died before baptism. And at that time, and Micheál can mention a little on this perhaps later on, there was this regulation. It was like having mothers churched and cleansed before they could go back in to receive sacraments in the church. Horrific stuff. There's no other way of describing it. Once in place in the Catholic Church. Equally, was this horrific, savage regulation that an unbaptized baby could not be buried in consecrated ground. And, you know, that's held true of for people who committed suicide. They weren't allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. But local people, and I have personal knowledge of this, defied that regulation of the Catholic Church and buried their little babies.
Buried babies. We all know people. Babies were buried in the Rocky. And I know